It was a biting February night in the remote wilderness of Montana, where the snow fell in thick, relentless sheets, shrouding the landscape in an icy stillness. Deep in this frozen expanse, nestled between towering pines, stood a solitary log cabin. Its lone occupant, Ethan, a former wildlife biologist, was bundled in a thick sweater by the fireplace, sipping coffee as the wind howled outside. For years he had sought refuge in this isolation, choosing the quiet companionship of nature over the noise of civilization. As the hours dragged on, the storm grew fiercer, shaking the cabin's wooden walls. Suddenly, a sound broke through the gale, a desperate, haunting howl that sent chills down Ethan's spine. He froze, his hand hovering over his coffee mug. Another howl followed, closer this time, joined by faint whimpers. He stood, grabbed a flashlight, and moved to the window. What he saw made his heart race. A large wolf, its fur matted with snow, standing just beyond the porch. But it wasn't alone. Lying in the snow beside it were 3 small wolf pups, barely moving. Their fragile forms trembled against the wind, their cries faint and pitiful. The mother wolf's piercing eyes met Ethan's through the frosted glass. There was no aggression in her gaze, only urgency. Ethan's instincts screamed at him to stay inside. He knew better than anyone that wolves were wild and unpredictable, especially when their young were involved. But something about the scene tugged at him, a primal call he couldn't ignore. The pup's frailty, the mother's silent plea. It was as if she knew he was her only chance. Ethan hesitated, his breath fogging the glass. "Why here? Why me?" he muttered, as if expecting an answer. Gathering his courage, Ethan cracked the door open, icy air flooding in. The mother wolf flinched but didn't retreat. Instead, she stood her ground, her body shielding the pups. Ethan grabbed an old wool blanket from the couch and tossed it out onto the snow. The pups, driven by instinct, crawled toward the warmth, their tiny paws sinking into the fabric. The mother let out a low, guttural noise, not a growl, but a sound filled with relief. Ethan watched in awe as she carefully nudged the blanket around her pups, the movements deliberate and tender. But as the storm howled louder and the temperature plummeted, Ethan knew the blanket wouldn't be enough. He couldn't just leave them out there. They wouldn't survive the night. His mind raced with options, each one more absurd than the last. Letting a wild wolf into his cabin? Insanity. But as he looked at the pups shivering violently and the mother wolf's trembling form, he knew he had no choice. "Okay," he whispered, opening the door wider. "But we're doing this on my terms." The mother wolf didn't move at first, her golden eyes locked on his. Then, as if understanding his words, she stepped forward cautiously, a massive frame filling the doorway. Ethan's heart pounded as she entered, her pups stumbling in after her. The warmth of the cabin enveloped them, and the pups collapsed onto the rug near the fire. The mother wolf stood between Ethan and her young, her eyes wary but calm. Hours passed in tense silence. The storm battered the cabin, snow piling up against the windows. Ethan sat in his chair, watching as the wolf curled protectively around her pups. He couldn't shake the surreal nature of the moment. A man and a wolf, sworn enemies in the wild, now sharing the same sanctuary. Suddenly, a loud crack echoed through the cabin. Ethan jumped to his feet, his heart racing. The roof. The weight of the snow was too much. Another crack followed, louder this time. Before Ethan could react, a section of the roof caved in, sending snow and debris crashing to the floor. Mother wolf let out a fierce growl, leaping to shield her pups from the falling wreckage. Ethan scrambled to his feet, grabbing a tarp to block the gaping hole. The wind and snow poured in, freezing the air inside the cabin. The wolf watched him, her muscles taut, ready to attack if he made a wrong move. But instead of lunging, she stepped forward, body shielding him from the cold as he secured the tarp. It was a gesture of trust, one that left Ethan stunned. As the storm raged on, Ethan realized they couldn't stay in the cabin. The damage was too severe, the cold too biting. "We need to get to the shelter," he muttered, grabbing his flashlight. Opening a trapdoor in the floor, he motioned for the wolf to follow. She hesitated, her instincts battling her desperation. But when one of her pups stumbled toward the opening, she followed, carrying the others gently in her jaws. In the cramped storm shelter below, the propane heater hummed softly, filling the space with warmth. Ethan leaned against the wall, his body aching from the night's chaos. The wolf lay in the corner, her pups huddled close, their tiny bodies finally at peace. For the first time, Ethan noticed the mother's thin frame, her ribs visible beneath her fur. She had been struggling long before the storm, driven to the brink by hunger and exhaustion. As dawn broke and the storm subsided, Ethan climbed back into the cabin to survey the damage. Snow covered the floor and the roof sagged dangerously. Returning to the shelter, he found the wolf awake, her eyes locked on his. "It's safe now," he said softly, opening the hatch. She rose slowly, nudging her pups up the narrow stairs. On the porch, the wolf paused, turning to face Ethan one last time. Her gaze was steady, filled with an emotion he couldn't quite name. Gratitude, perhaps. Then, with a soft huff, she led her pups into the forest, disappearing among the trees. Ethan stood in the doorway, the silence of the morning washing over him. The cabin was a wreck, but his heart was full. He had spent years studying the wild, but nothing had prepared him for this. A bond forged in the depths of a storm, a connection that transcended fear. As he began to clean up, he couldn't help but wonder, what would others have done in his place? Would they have opened the door? And what about you? Would you have risked it all to save a wild animal in need? Let us know in the comments below.